Okay, so to begin with, let's remind ourselves of what was happening in the world back in 2020 when we started this project. I'm sure we all remember what was happening. Internationally, in that first year of the pandemic, anti-Asian racism and hate crimes specifically targeting East Asian communities and later South Asian communities were widely reported. It was anecdotally reported, particularly in Europe and white settler nations such as the US and Canada. In Australia, in January and February 2020, 1 in 4 people who reported racism to the Human Rights Commission linked that experience to the pandemic context. A few months later, in April 2020, the Australian Race Discrimination Commissioner Chin Tan called for a national response to the pandemic racism, which included a call for research on Asian Australians' experiences. Research conducted by myself and others at the Challenging Racism Project prior to the pandemic found that Australians born in Asia are twice as likely to experience racism as other people living in Australia. Reports of anti-Asian racism in Australia during the pandemic was therefore an urgent and serious concern. So I wasn't part of Chris when I came up with this project idea, so I thank Chris for giving me the funding, the team, and the additional funding from DPC Victoria. And for Chris for welcoming me into the fold. So, in response to this context, the screen's doing something different down there. In response to this context, the project aimed to measure the type and frequency of self-identified Asian Australians' experiences of racism during the pandemic. It also aimed to gauge relationships between experiencing and witnessing racism, which is often not examined. So experiencing and witnessing racism with mental health, wellbeing and sense of belonging, and therefore broader social cohesion. It also aimed to understand how participants responded to witnessing and experiencing racism. So speaking to Jonathan's earlier project about data gaps, how did participants respond, including did they report? And going one step further, we sought to identify barriers to that response or reporting of racism. And this, of course, has really important implications on policy and processes across sectors, across organisations and across institutions. So in order to achieve these aims, we conducted an online national survey of just over 2,000 self-identified Asian Australians between November 2020 and February 2021. And to my knowledge, this was and continues to be the largest, most extensive and empirically robust survey of pandemic racism in Australia. So I'm actually not going to talk about the project findings in this session. We'll be talking about those later when we launch our translational materials. Unfortunately, you will not be surprised by our project findings. Our recommendations for policy and practice regarding those findings can be found in our policy summary document on the CRIS website, but we'll also be reiterating those later on this afternoon at our launch, in our launch session. So to respond to Mark's question about community consultation and working with partners, after the publication, this was one part of it, after the publication of our report, that was in 2021, we returned the report and the findings to community members via focus group discussions and asked for their feedback, what they wanted us to do next. And that was, so we published the report in July and we conducted those consultations in August and September 2021. Again, we'll be speaking more about that process at our launch event later on this afternoon. But it was those consultations and those recommendations from community that have shaped what we have done next, what we have produced. So I now want to talk a little bit about reach and impact. Michelle and Jonathan have already stolen some of my thunder and spoken a bit about that, but I want to give a bit more detail. So this project and its findings has reached many, many other anti-racism practitioners and influenced their practice. So Kate Xavier, who I believe is online, I think she's pretty famous today, she's been mentioned about 4 times. So wonderful Kate, who's an anti-racism educator and practitioner, she was recently community cohesion consultant with the Association of Independent Schools of New South Wales. So in her practice, Kate had heard many anecdotal reports of racism from her students. But she tells me that our research helped frame those anecdotal reports into a broader context that had empirical grounding. It showed her the scale of the problem and what could be done to challenge that racism. So particularly useful to Kate was the data regarding young people's experiences of racism online, as well as the impacts or correlations between experiencing racism and their sense of belonging. Our project also directly influenced Kate's own careful choice of language in her community cohesion projects. So one of the outputs that Kate developed as part of her community cohesion role was the production of 7 free online training modules for teachers on topics such as fostering intercultural understanding in the classroom. And using our project and its findings, these modules include several case studies that explore the impacts of racism on Australians, particularly of Asian background, as well as international students of Asian background. So I think that's a huge case study of how our research can actually be used in the real world. And again, going back to what Jonathan was saying about reach and impact, sometimes we don't know about how it's being used. I only know about this because I bumped into Kate at an event and she recognised me and told me all about it. The second example I want to give is in relation to the Asian Australian Lawyers Association, particularly their New South Wales chapter, and we'll be meeting some of their members, the Victorian members, tonight and tomorrow. So the Asian Australian Lawyers Association actually conducted their own pilot research on the experiences of racism of solicitors, so how they were experiencing racism in their workplace. I was asked to present some of our findings at their report launch alongside Mariam Vazide and the Race Discrimination Commissioner Chintan. When I presented our findings, the Lawyers Association realised that if racism was being underreported, which our findings showed, then so too were other forms of hate crime and assault, such as sexual assault. They were also most likely to be underreported for pretty much the same reasons. So this led the association to develop a workplace reporting tool, an outcome inspired by our report. And another way that the Lawyers Association seeks to provide workplace support is through the publication of a workplace guide and model discrimination and harassment policy document. And it's used by varying degrees by law firms across the country for best workplace policy. Our project and its findings have helped inform their latest policy update. So again, I think that's a huge achievement and something that we should all be very proud of. So I'm going to leave it there and stay tuned for a later session where I will be and the team will be launching some of those translational materials. Thank you.